Thank you. Who scares you? I don't mean what scares you, but what does the person look like who gives you a pit in your stomach, makes you cross the street, subvert eye contact, and maybe lock the doors in your car a little faster? Fear is a natural, uncontrollable response. But what we do with that fear becomes a choice. Studies now tell us that 98% of our brains work unconsciously. What affects our conscious brain? How do we process all of this information? From birth, we are bombarded with messages that our brain categorizes and internalizes, which affect our thoughts and actions. And all of us have unconscious biases. And if we are to effectuate real, authentic community change and true community relationship building, we must all individually dig deeper to understand what triggers our fears, especially when we're talking about racism or any ism, really. I, too, have a lot of unconscious biases. Just the other day, I was chatting it up with the cashier at the grocery store, who was a young Asian man with no accent, just like me. But I caught myself. I felt my brain being surprised that he had no accent. And I paused, and I started to have a conversation with myself right then on why. And when I took an implicit association test, which showed me that I favor lighter-skinned people over darker-skinned people, I hit the pause button again. Now I use this information to make sure that when those opportunities present themselves, I don't slip back into my unconscious bias. Personal interactions with those who are different than us is what dissipates that fear, that knot in your stomach. Oftentimes, my friends tell me, I hear about Islam and Muslims in the media, and I know you're not like that as an American Muslim. I'm here to tell you that I am not the exception to the rule. I just happen to have become a person that you've interacted with who contextualizes what it means to be an American Muslim. And now you're starting to understand that the rhetoric that you've been hearing and possibly internalizing is what is actually false. I am not the anomaly, but the norm. But what happens when you live in a place where you don't have the opportunity for personal contact with someone who looks or believes differently than you? What happens is that fear-mongering and stereotypes slowly seep into our discourse and slowly become true. And when faith leaders and elected officials preach and legislate this fear, it starts to become right. So it's no surprise that the now identified Islamophobic network imports their fear-filled messaging and institutions into rural America, where there is essentially no probability of humanizing the other. This messaging is working so well that since 2010, 120 anti-Islamic bills were introduced in 42 states. And 15 such hateful laws have been passed. Laws. We are again legislating fear and hate, just a different target. I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. There may be about 2,000 to 3,000 Muslims in our state. That's literally 0.003% of our state's population. And not surprisingly, South Dakota is one of those 15 states which has passed anti-Sharia legislation in 2012, signed by our current governor into law. What is Sharia law? A question I get asked all the time. First, it's a misnomer. Sharia is not law as we understand the U.S. Constitution or Civil Code. Sharia are our guiding principles just as the 10 Commandments and love of mercy, stories of love and mercy. Sharia teaches us to be good people, good stewards of this earth, to provide refuge to orphans, to feed the hungry, dress modestly, pay charity, worship God. Be a good person, just like every other religion does. But what the Islamophobes and the fearmongers will have you believe is that Muslims, we want to enforce some sort of archaic penal code of chopping off hands and heads, stoning people to death, and taking away women's rights, and that our U.S. Constitution is in jeopardy of being overtaken by these medieval practices. By the way, those punishments or penal codes are also found in the Bible and Torah. If you know anything about government or how constitutions are amended, you know that 0.003% of the population doesn't have that political clout. So this is pure fear-mongering. Hateful legislation is garnering so much momentum in rural America, and it's now making appearances in Washington, D.C. The Islamophobic network's main purpose is to have you so scared of Islam and Muslims, they want to legally delegitimize a religion which is 14 centuries old, stripping Muslims of our founding principles and protections of freedom of and freedom from religion. What is this Islamophobic network? Since 2015, it's burgeoned into this $57 million industry. The Center for American Progress and the Haas Institute have revealed a tightly knit collaboration of foundations, think tanks, media platforms, grassroots organizations, elected officials, and figureheads, many of whom are former Muslims. Islamophobes' dream come true in spreading fear in rural America. We need to understand that this fear is being imported into rural America to change the hearts and minds of otherwise hardworking, good, neighborly communities who just don't have the exposure to Muslims and Islam as practiced by 1.5 billion people worldwide, peacefully and lovingly. This past legislative session, South Dakota had 2 Islamophobic resolutions, and I'm ecstatic to report to you that our amazing, authentically intersectional coalition defeated both of them. For the first time, a coalition of immigrants, refugees, Muslims, and our beautiful allies showed up together over and over to testify against legislating hate. The proponent side had a lobbyist from a known Islamophobic, anti-refugee hate group called Act for America. They even had an expert call in to the committee hearing room from Sweden who testified that 90% of the rapes in Sweden are committed by Somali Muslim men. Absurd. Just the other day, I was at an event where an adjunct professor from a local university actually quoted that statistic. Pay attention to Islamophobia wherever you live. Here in South Dakota, we had a candidate for governor and for Congress show up to a hate group event. And legislators are continuously attending the over dozens of Islamophobic speaker events held throughout our state. After my testimony and being outspoken about Islamophobia wherever it rears its ugly head, elected officials and those running for office have tried to delegitimate my voice. One senator on Twitter called me a terrorist sympathizer, while another one accused me of receiving funding from terrorist organizations to do this work. And on Facebook, a candidate for governor of this state said that I should be tried for treason for associating with terrorists. Freedom of speech is surely a two-way street, but these are provable, blatant lies. Know that Islamophobia is real and rampant, and I have 3 asks for you today. Be self-reflective, identify your biases, and work on changing your response. If you don't have the opportunity to meet diverse people, find other ways to learn about them through authentic sources. And most importantly, speak out against fear-mongering and hate of Islam, Muslims, immigrants, and refugees when it shows up at your dinner table and at your legislator. We can no longer afford to be bystanders to legislated hate. Be an upstander and break the momentum of Islamophobia in rural America by supporting local organizations that are doing this real work. Before I close today, I just have one more question for you. Do I scare you? Does this image cause surprise, give you a pit in your stomach, or maybe thoughts that I must somehow be oppressed? If your answer is yes or maybe, now it's up to you to dig deeper to figure out why. Or are you going to let your fear influence your thoughts and your actions, or worse, your unconscious impact? Thank you.